I want to get your response to what the president said about you today in London. Let's just listen to that for a second.
I think Adam Schiff is a deranged human being. I think he grew up with a complex for lots of reasons that are obvious. I think he's a very sick man, and he lies.
Now, as I said, we're going to have a psychiatrist actually react to that later in the hour. But what did you feel when you heard that today?
Well, he gets more and more untethered over time. I certainly had the same impression that you're likely to hear from the professional who comes on your show, which is this is a president who has done nothing but project onto others his own lack of morality. That's unfortunately not a unique character trait or pathology to this president. We see it exhibited in some of the members of Congress. But that's certainly what appears to be the case as far as I'm concerned.
Now, you, of course, we've all seen you shrug off these kinds of comments by the president in the past. But it's comments like that about some of the witnesses in this case that actually found their way into your report. And you suggest that that includes witness intimidation by the president.
Yes, and this part of a long pattern, which goes back to the Mueller investigation, in which he was calling those who would cooperate with authorities like Michael Cohen a rat, in which he would praise people like Manafort, guilty of multiple federal crimes, because he wouldn't cooperate with authorities, and in which he would attack anyone who spoke critically of him, or even more seriously, exposed wrongdoing, misconduct, abuse by him. And of course, his greatest venom is reserved for the whistleblower, because the president believes he has a God-given right as president of the United States to abuse the power of his office and not have to suffer people exposing it, who he considers to be traitors and spies. If you consider people who expose wrongdoing as traitors and spies, it's because you think you are the state, that your interests are commensurate, equal to, coextensive with the interests of the United States. That is not the case here. And sadly, we have a president who believes that he has every right to use and abuse the power of his office to help his reelection campaign, to coerce allies to do his dirty work. And the American people have a right and a need to expect better in the president of the United States.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.